George, thank you so much for joining us today at Luminos. We're thrilled to have you and to discuss what is a really important series of conversations that we're having related to education, leadership, and crisis, how leaders have helped education systems navigate circumstances of crisis leading up to today's huge COVID pandemic. And we're looking to draw lessons from history to inform practices and progress in the present. And so, George, you're one of the unique ministers, former ministers of education in the world, who has had the heavyweight experience of leading Liberia through a reconstruction of the education system post Ebola. So the Ebola crisis, as I understood it, was the largest Ebola crisis on record in history that spanned between 2013 and 2016. So we'd love to talk about that, your experience as Minister of Education through that, but also take a look at your journey as a professional in the education space. So maybe perhaps, George, take us back to the beginning. What led you into education? Tell us how you became minister and sort of how you navigated Liberia through the crisis.
So Mabuso, thank you very much. Through you, the Luminos family, for this opportunity to share my story, and hopefully those who are watching or listening will gain some meaningful insights. I got interested in the education sector right early on in high school. I admired the Catholic missionaries who came to Africa and sacrificed their time to teach. And I grew up and lived with them from the Adorers of the Blood of Christ sisters, 5 of whom were killed during the Liberian Civil War, and then the Marist Brothers of the schools. And actually, I was in the 11th grade when the Liberian Civil War broke out. So I became a refugee in Cote d'Ivoire, then in Ghana, and I actually completed high school in Ghana and became a member of this Catholic religious teaching body called, again, Marist Brothers of the Schools. And that took me to many places in Africa, including Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and then my own home country, Liberia, teaching actually. That introduced me in a very systemic way and diverse way to the education sector, not just in Liberia, but across the length and breadth of Africa. And then I ended up in the United States, in upstate New York, where the brothers do have they started a college there called Marist College, and I lived across from there, across the Hudson River, and continued to do work with the brothers, Lady of Lourdes High School in Poughkeepsie, New York. And then, yeah, that really set my story for my teaching career. When I left the brothers, I became interested in institutions and their impact on people, especially with service delivery. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania, where School of Social Policy and Practice, where I learned a lot about social work, healthcare, education, and the rest. And I was a fellow at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, exposing me to pediatric medicine and the rest of it. And I came back to Liberia after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania and began teaching at the local Catholic college here called Mother Paten College of Health Sciences, social policy, penology, and social deviance, those kinds of issues. And within that process, I expressed interest in working in government and applied for a job, got interviewed, and was given that job within the Civil Service Agency. Now in Liberia, the Civil Service Agency is the equivalent, perhaps in other parts of Africa, of the Ministry of Public Service. We are so small a country, the Civil Service Agency is devoted to the entire government workforce. in Liberia. So I started working there as an assistant to the head of the institution. And that started in 2011, actually. And I was there for 2 years as a technical assistant. And when that head was appointed as ambassador, President Sirleaf asked me if I could lead the institution with key mandates for reforming the entire public service post-war. So I was there when Ebola broke out in 2014. And that meant I was in charge of the government workforce, the entire workforce during Ebola. And the first thing was to have cabinet agreements around safety for government workforce. So that meant to policies about decongesting all government institutions, the difference between essential and non-essential workers. We implemented that, making sure that issues around universal precautions were instituted in all government ministries, hygiene, the now commonplace hand washing, and all of those things were implemented so that we wouldn't have the incidents of Ebola in government institutions. So once that was done and government seemed stable and civil servants were still being paid, at November of 2014, there was the nomination made for me to become health minister, but that didn't happen. So by June of 2015, I got nominated to be education minister. So I landed at education actually when the shadow of Ebola was waning. And that meant I had to reopen schools safely that had been closed for at least 6 months. And that meant I had, as you rightly said, to reset the entire school calendar, repurpose the strategy, and make sure that we had children coming back to school and parents were sending their children back to school with the degree of confidence that was required. So in a nutshell, that's how I got into government, and that's how I started my interest in education.
Thank you. I would say that one of the common challenges for ministers of education is figuring out how to use a limited resource base to execute on broad and sometimes very ambitious plans. So speak to us about how you were able to navigate the financial potential constraints around everything that you wanted to accomplish.
My first instinct for improving the fiscal space was to look within, not look without. I did think of befriending the finance minister. So the finance minister was a good friend of mine. The finance ministry is a place where money goes and many people go after it because it has multiple uses, you know. So you got to be friendly. You got to befriend the finance minister to get your priorities front and center. So I made the finance minister a good friend, and that gave us some leverage, but even that was not enough to meet the needs of the entire sector. After Ebola, when we did the school census, we found out that enrollment had ticked up somewhat. Given the work we had done to bring children safely back, we had around 1.5 million children in school, maybe around 500,000 still out, but we had a significant number of children in school, and we needed to improve quality, and that meant we needed more money. But the money we were giving, anywhere around 40 million annually for entire education sector, was not enough. It was just paying for personnel services. That was it. There was no money. So the next thing, apart from looking to the Ministry of Finance, was to look within my own institution, the ministry, for what we call then efficiency savings. Where were the leakages to be able to say, we can save this amount and prove that we are managing government resources efficiently and effectively. So we did a comprehensive payroll audit with the support of a partner. That payroll audit included testing the literacy and numeracy of all the teachers in the country to be able to make sure that Those who became capable at the end of the war were now going to be made competent to be in the classroom. So that was controversial because it hadn't been done before. The payroll audit was controversial. Remember, I had 2 years for the Salif administration to end. And I was like Speedy Gonzalez, trying to accomplish so much in 2 years. I was also writing the education strategy that included a public-private partnership that was also controversial. So after that audit, we realized we saved around $3 million. So part of what we used the $3 million for was to rehire teachers, train teachers to put back in the system and to get rid of the deadwood. And we also got a significant generosity from the Global Partnership for Education, a grant into which we costed a significant amount to be able to work on workforce reform still. And that project is just about starting, by the way. So befriend the Minister of Finance, look within your own institutions for efficiency savings, then look without with the strategy. First have your plan, then look without for the strategy to see if you can gain attraction from potential funders, philanthropies, multilateral institutions, and the rest of them. So that was the strategy we pursued to improve the fiscal space for the sector.
That's really helpful, and I appreciate how you structured that in very clear steps. I imagine that there's both a political and a social dynamic in terms of working with everyone from the grass tops, the stakeholders who are making the bold, large decision, all the way to the grassroots, the communities, the families, the children themselves, the teachers. And in a short space, you mentioned Speedy Gonzalez, in a short space of 2 years, you had to get everybody singing from the same hymn sheet. Speak to us about the faculties and the skills a minister needs to have, not just the minister, but his entire team, to be able to get everybody to play the same game in such a rapid process of change.
So you're right on that, and I'm glad you mentioned team, because without the team, it cannot be done. And in education, the team is so diverse. It's not just the civil servants you're working with. You have partners to bring together around core issues of reform. You have the teachers' unions to bring around core issues of reform. You have student bodies, you have parent bodies, you have school administrators, all of this, a broad coalition of people to bring around. And as you know, in education, everybody has an opinion as to how it can be done. So I admittedly had difficulty. We knew what we wanted to achieve, but I had difficulty communicating that, in part because I did not know the vital role mainstreaming communications will play in getting a message across. I assumed that I knew what the public good was that we were trying to deliver, and the public would understand what the good was that we were trying to deliver. It's not exactly that way because there are vested interests. So the message of, for example, bringing non-governmental sector workers to provide education in partnership with government, called it a public-private partnership, was misunderstood by teachers' unions. They thought that we were privatizing schools and that would displace teachers who were essentially civil servants. No, that wasn't true, but we failed on the communications part, so they got ahead of us. When we were doing the teachers' audit and testing teachers, the message was that we were trying to improve the sector by bringing in people who were trained and would take teaching as a career, but we didn't communicate that well again. It was thought that we were going to fire people to bring in foreign teachers by the providers that we were bringing in to the country. So one of the biggest lessons I learned is that sometimes within an emergency with so much speed, you can forget how to communicate the benefits of what you are trying to do. The second thing was, sometimes you can use the parents, the teachers to be communicators, the teachers themselves, because once we started doing these reforms and the benefits started kicking in, and we focused our reform, my reform as minister was focused on foundational learning, early childhood and primary education. I knew that that was our key problem, and I still believe it's still the key problem in Liberia and elsewhere. We have very weak foundation, and so our high schools and our colleges are not producing the skilled talent we need for today's workforce in Africa. So we focus mainly on foundational learning. And by that, we made much of it free. And Luminos came on board and started attracting students that were out of school. So people started seeing benefits in the communities and all of that. And so the message was beginning to get through, but we were late. We were late in telling people ahead of time the benefits of the reforms. And so that was one of the biggest mistakes I made. But one of the things that I think I'm proud of that we were able to do was to form a broad coalition. And in this instance, the World Bank was good, using the premises of Georgetown University to bring together a key group of cabinet ministers who I wanted on board my team to be able to support me on the cabinet. So we went to the Hariri Center at Georgetown University, where we spent a week together, where we drilled through the reforms to be able to see what were the pros and cons, who was for and who was against, and how to navigate all of these particular areas. So it's important to have a broad coalition as you possibly can. It's important to pay attention to communications. It's important to identify agents of change, to use them, not necessarily your core team, to get the message as far as you can.
There's a quote that I'm very fond of. It's from Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he says, "I would not give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I'd give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity." And I think of that quote as I'm listening to you, because it appears to me that in your description of building these broad coalitions, one of the things that you need to do is create an effective, simple, clear message that can be taken up as a marshalling call by everybody. And so how do you look into the eyes of a very complex context and situation and distill from that very simple messaging and tactics around which everybody can come together?
Well, there's a clear moral purpose. There's a clear moral responsibility to what we are trying to do to achieve here. You cannot fail the next generation of children. If you do so, you undermine the very existence of your peace that you enjoy, particularly in countries like Liberia, fragile nations that have gone through civil war. You undermine that. So if you want bridges, if you want hospitals to function well, good nurses, good doctors, and all of these people, if you want engineers, if you want good presidents, you ought to invest in children. And right from the beginning of the pipeline to its end. So there is a clear moral purpose to this. And I think once people get that core message that we have a moral responsibility to our children not to fail them, and we should do whatever it takes to make sure that every child, regardless of disability, regardless of gender, regardless of whether or not they come from low-income families, must have equal access to quality education, because it is our moral responsibility to make sure we have citizens who are not just healthy, but who are literate and numerate and productive to grow the economy and to make sure that we transmit this from one generation to another. If we fail to do that, we are, in essence, failing the next generation of our children.
Well said, well said. Now, for those of us who aren't in politics, there is a sort of a curiosity around the extent to which politics can be an enabler of progress and reform, and the extent to which it can be an encumbrance. Could you perhaps talk to it from your vantage point? How do you navigate the political spectrum and game?
So we've talked in the last year, prior to the coronavirus breaking out, we talked about what we call the 3 Ps in education reform: the policy, politics, and practice. In a democracy, much of public policy is a compromise, especially if you have a US-style democracy where we have parliaments or legislators. That group is a gathering of diverse opinions and philosophies about what government should be. And we don't all agree on what education is and what it should achieve in this sense. So therefore, you have to navigate as carefully as you can from the executive to the legislative branch mainly, in terms of what is it that you want to achieve in this particular form of education reform, so to speak. So the politics become very difficult because if you administer, you're serving at the will and pleasure of the executive, the head of the executive, the president. And the head of the executive happens to be a member of a political party. When you move across the aisle to the legislature, it's not just the president's party that is there. There are other members from the opposition party. You have to manage to navigate that politics. The second point is that you're lucky if you have political championship, and that begins with your boss. In my own case, I was more than lucky. I had a president who understood the significance of human capital development and was behind more than 100%. There were competing priorities, of course. Our budget very small, about $500 million in the post-war country where you needed probably 5 times as much to do what you wanted to do. So it wasn't easy to get the priorities straight for education. But I was lucky that I had that championship from the chief executive all the way to my cabinet colleagues. It helped a lot to navigate the politics. There's also a bit of it that there's something else that just occurred to me, that you should have a defined purpose. In our own case, it was the education strategy, and it came out of stakeholder negotiations and peer review processes, the education sector plan. And it had a broad range of quantitative data, qualitative data, in essence, based on evidence, and it was clear. So armed with evidence, it helps to navigate politics. But let me tell you, it's a very, very difficult thing to navigate, and I shouldn't downplay how essential to be politically intelligent can be to achieving what it is that you want to achieve in reforming, whether health or education.
That's really helpful. Most ministers will have anywhere between, in your case, 2 years. Some will have 4, some will have 5, 6, but it's generally a short term in which you have to sort of pick up the reins of the education system and lead it to a place that is better than where you picked up. Is there some disconnect between the short-term nature of the ministerial responsibility and the long arc of education reform and development that perhaps creates an inconsistency in the way administration to administration may pursue a national education agenda?
So what happens, Mabuso, and you know this too, is that we're back to the same politics. It's difficult for people to read evidence, the fine prints of evidence, percentage of students who are achieving learning outcomes versus percentage of students who are out of school or in school are not learning. Politicians don't have that patience to go to the rubrics of all of these arguments, the numbers and stuff like that. Politicians are more apt to show a bridge, a building, and the citizens are more apt to see what is concrete as opposed to what is based in policy or other sorts of written evidence. People don't read that much. So therefore, it is hard to argue for human capital development in that regard. People want to see bridges, and politicians who are angling for re-election want to show that they are doing some concrete things. And those concrete things don't necessarily come across as you and I would understand them to the ordinary eye. And so that's one of the major problems of being able to get across to people in this regard.
I think about the old adage, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. I imagine for a minister of education, there are people everywhere, but perhaps not a voice of guidance or mentorship available to me. Where do you get your advice? What is your kitchen cabinet, as it were, as a minister when you're making decisions?
So, government ministries are very bloated. You could have 400 people in your ministry, but you find 5 or 10 people who are capable of teaming up with you to achieve a reform agenda. So the first group of people I turn to, my core team, civil servants, political appointees with whom I work to deliver. But also there are usually advisory groups, and this will be either by law, an advisory group set up by the president. But also you have the local education group that is composed of private sector people who work in the sector, NGOs, your USAID, your UNICEF, your World Bank representatives. And so you meet with them every now and then for advice. You can have some diplomats who are also interested. Then you have other sorts of funders from the world of philanthropy and the rest of them that you can turn to. But the most important advice comes from, I believe, from your own reflection. And this is what ministers don't have time for. Because the way institutions are built, they build to do transactional stuff. You are signing things, you are shaking hands, so much so that you forget that the transformational stuff is what you're there for, to change based on the mandate and function of the ministry. And the only time you can think about transformation is when you give yourself that time to reflect upon what it is that you are doing. And from that period of reflection, you can get some useful advice or feedback as to what better step you might be able to take to achieve what it is that you want to achieve.
That's helpful. So let's drill down to the question that is on everybody's minds right now, the question of learning loss. When children are out of school, whatever they've learned prior to that break and departure from the classroom is easily lost. And that's not to say that parents aren't educating their children and that the community is not a vibrant space for children to learn. But in terms of the core academic curriculum that is established in the national agenda, it's difficult for children to keep a memory of what it is that they've formally learned. And so maybe this is a nice segue as well into the conversation about the current COVID-19 pandemic. Could you perhaps take us from Ebola and sort of what focus your team had on the question of learning loss and what you did about it, and sort of what lessons you might draw from that to inform conversations that are currently taking place about learning loss and the question of whether to open schools or not, as various countries are having.
So after Ebola, our first priority, as I said earlier, was to make sure that schools were reopened safely. And that meant doing the things that made people feel safe. Put the messages on radio that schools were going to be reopened and that teachers were being trained in psychosocial support because we had been through a lot of trauma. We're being given some basic pedagogical skills, but then also it meant sanitizing all of the schools too, and putting in place the hand washing protocol to make sure. So in essence, we prioritized safety, and we hoped that safety will lead to access in enrollment numbers. And then on that, we will build quality, meaning focusing on teacher training and all of those kinds of things. And so that's what we focused on. But we also felt that, hey, our country, Liberia, is way behind others in terms of learning outcomes by all of these statistics. We have a lower form of the West African Examination Council exams. That was then, we changed it now. But we needed to leapfrog to catch up with them. And I always go back to the Brookings Institution study that said that children in the developing world would take 100 years to catch up with their counterparts in the developed world if things were not changed drastically, which is what led me to the belief that, number one, within the context of the crisis, whether be it for Ebola or for COVID-19, you need strong partnerships. Government needs strong partnerships, collaborative interventions to forge ahead and to solve the outstanding problem of the learning crisis. Let's pay attention to the fact that before COVID-19, we knew that there were probably around, 260 children out of school. The 260 million out of school. 330 million in school, but they were not learning. The ones who were putting out of school, mainly graduating, didn't have the required skills and knowledge to meet labor market demands. So we had a problem. The assumption even was that by 2030, half of the world's children will be failing anyway. So you see, this was already a crisis. Now you have COVID-19. It has compounded the crisis, but also it has given us an opportunity, which is where distance learning has come from. But my fear is that we are using the familiar to define the unfamiliar. There is not a lot of thinking outside of the box. For example, if we are going to use long distance learning, how have we considered access to digital literacy, which is not commonplace in rural Africa? That means if we don't do digital literacy advocacy and access enough, many more children will still be left behind. And many more teachers, particularly teachers who are before my generation and don't know anything about how the computer operates or how a cell phone operates, will be left behind. So there has to be some kind of radical movement to repurpose, to use your word again, to repurpose the meaning of this crisis. I think it's calling us to be radical. It's calling us to reimagine what the classroom is, what the classroom could be, and maybe the past will shed a lot of light on these issues. For example, in post-independent Zimbabwe, a classroom wasn't necessarily a full war room. It was under a tree, but learning was effective, right? So if we're thinking about all of these things over and over again, I think we need to look at the crisis that we inherited, but COVID-19 is providing us with a reflective moment in time to be able to rethink how we deliver learning and how we measure it. True, we have, in essence, quickly put together programs and put them on air and put them in text messaging, WhatsApp, and the rest. But how are you going to measure this in rural parts of Africa? How are you going to know that learning is taking place? How are you going to know that children are opening those laptops if it's available or listening to the radio? They are vulnerable people. There are people who, for example, used to go to school and find their meals in school. They no longer have that meals, so they have to go with their parents on the farm to find those meals. There are girls who were left out of school for different reasons. There are people with disability who were left out. How are we supposed to engineer a new system within the digital age where nobody is left behind? So I believe there are questions we have to answer, and this is more of an opportunity beyond the crisis for me.
I wonder, when you think about the work that's involved in addressing all of those issues, what is the role of philanthropy in your mind? I know you've had a lot of engagement with the philanthropic sector during the course of your tenure. What would you say to the philanthropic sector today as they focus on education responses in the COVID-19 context?
Well, first of all, to thank everybody who has responded positively to the cause of government. And I say to the cause of government because I do not think that philanthropists should do what government ought to be doing. Philanthropists should support government by becoming catalysts and by bringing together much needed funding that around outcomes, around performance. There's no one who can do what governments are doing. Governments spend the most money for education and provide the enabling environment. What philanthropists do and partners do is to support proven government programs to achieve meaningful outcomes for children. That's it. So be that catalytic intervention that supports government efforts aimed at measuring outcomes and financing performance. I think that should be the role of philanthropic giving in this time.
George, I want to cast you back to when you were a child. One of the things that we think about as people involved in education is the importance of reading, but I'm not sure that we often take enough time to think about our own journey in reading. So I want to take you back there. From when you were a child, what favorite books did you enjoy? What comes to mind?
Oh, I have many, and I like to talk about them. The first one that really got to me was Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, especially the chapter in which Okonkwo kills Ikemefuna out of the tradition. That was one of those books that really got to me in my childhood. The second one was Kamara Lai's The African Child, L'Enfant Noir. It was the first time I came face to face with somebody talking about the nature of an African village and the culture around African villages and all of that. So I remember The African Child, L'Enfant Noir in French. The next one was Peter Abraham's The Mine Boy, I think out of South Africa, right? So there are others that I could talk about, from Things Fall Apart to The African Child, The Mine Boy, and one of the most impactful ones I read is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who came out of Nazi Germany, survivor out of Nazi Germany. So those books have been very inspirational to me personally in my own life, even to date.
And so let's talk about today. Are there any particular books that, apart from those that you've mentioned, that are really pillars of your reading journey?
I have read, nowadays I am interested in people and their life stories, right? So I have read Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. I have read Ellen Johnson's Leave This Child Will Be Great. I have read Born a Crime by the host of today's show, Trevor Noah, and many other books. But those three come to mind right now. Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, Ellen Johnson's Leave This Child Will Be Great, and Trevor Noah's Born a Crime.
George, you've been a great guest. Perhaps as a parting shot, I'd ask you to distill your knowledge, your experience, and your thoughts into a few words for us here. What advice do you have for us as a global community as we are seeking to push forward and create a world in which every child has a real chance at a good education?
I think that we have a moral obligation to our children, not to fail them. We should not shrink from our responsibility, particularly as regards the Sustainable Development Goals. We should do whatever we can to make sure that those goals are met, no matter the cost. And COVID-19 makes it especially binding on us to make sure that we fulfill that moral responsibility which we have towards all children, especially the ones who are most in need, the ones who don't have any kind of support structure, such as the ones that the Luminos Fund finds and gives a chance, the second chance. We must do that for all children universally, no matter where they are.
George, thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.